In Ohio, Curtis looked at giant clouds in the sky while standing in the rain, confused because instead of water, it appeared to be motor oil. However, it was just a dream and the weather was really nice. Afterwards, Curtis had breakfast with his wife Samantha and deaf daughter Hannah before going to work. Curtis worked for a construction company while Samantha was a housewife who took care of Hannah, but she also sewed clothes to sell at the local fair on Saturdays. That afternoon, Samantha spent time with friends at home who had brought their children to the meeting. One of them noticed that Hannah had used a nail to grab a dangerous piece of wood. So Samantha had to run out to stop him, because shouting warnings clearly didn't work. A while later, it started to rain heavily. The construction workers had to stop for the day and the employees drank together at the bar. At home, Samantha teaches Anna the signs of a storm while watching the rain through the window. After the bar, Curtis took his coworker and close friend Duarte home. They talked for a while and Duarte said that Curtis was living a great life. However, Curtis admits that things are not always as beautiful as they seem. Their conversation was interrupted when Duarte's wife walked out, quietly asking him to come inside. Later, Curtis went home and checked on Hannah, while Samantha shared that the girl was still having trouble connecting with other kids. The next day, Curtis cleaned out the trash, so Hannah wouldn't take any more dangerous items. At that moment, a fierce storm appeared in the sky and suddenly lightning struck the ground, causing Curtis' dog Red to bark like crazy. When Curtis went to hold Hannah's hand, the dog broke free from its leash and attacked Curtis, viciously biting his arm. However, Curtis woke up in his room because it was yet another nightmare. During breakfast, Curtis couldn't help but think about how real the dream was. He saw Hannah playing with Red and felt worried, so he took her away from the dog. When Samantha asked what was wrong, Curtis snapped and left without even touching his breakfast. Later, at work, Curtis continued to lose focus and kept looking at his arm during the meeting thinking that he might still feel pain. Boss Jim is angry about the rain delay and wants them to catch up today. On the way to the location, Curtis asked Duarte to help him gather some more supplies first. Afterwards, Curtis rested and saw a flock of black birds in the sky flying in strange shapes. He asked Duarte if he felt strange, but Duarte didn't see anything. Because he had to work overtime to make it on time, Curtis arrived late to the parent-teacher conference at Hannah's school. He was also covered in mud because he couldn't bathe. They were taught more about the necessary sign language for their children, which Curtis had to practice more. Since he hasn't spent as much time with Hannah as he has with Samantha, he still doesn't know enough words. Sometime later, it rained again and Curtis hurried into the car with his daughter. The rain made it difficult to see and caused them to collide. Curtis's head was bleeding, but Hannah was fine. At that moment, men appeared outside the car and started smashing the windows. One guy restrained Curtis while the other kidnapped the girl. Suddenly, Curtis woke up screaming and realized it was another dream. He then came downstairs looking quite ill. Samantha notices this and is worried, but Curtis promises that it's just a cold and tells her to go to the fair with Hannah. While Samantha sells her products and argues with customers about prices, Curtis takes the extra supplies he got at work and builds a fence around the doghouse before locking Red up and apologizing to him. Poor guy, he should be taking out the trash right now, but he was distracted by the door leading to the storm shelter. Curtis finds the key in an old jar and opens it. Then he goes down to think of a new idea. Later that evening, Samantha invested the money she won at the fair with her vacation savings. She asks Curtis why Red is being kept outside now, but Curtis only gives a vague answer. Samantha tries again, but Curtis ignores her to listen to the news, where they talk about a gas leak that has affected a small family. This fed Curtis's paranoia. The next day, Curtis finds Hannah watching the storm through the window. As he approached, he was surprised to see a man standing outside watching them. Curtis immediately picked Hannah up and ran away when the man began trying to open the door. Suddenly, the entire building began to shake and all the objects in the living room went flying as Curtis struggled to breathe. Then everything fell apart and Curtis gasped as he woke up from another nightmare. To his surprise, he wet the bed. When Samantha walked in, he covered her wound with a blanket. Curtis asks for the doctor's number and Samantha tries to check on him out of concern, but Curtis answers curtly to prevent her from seeing the wet bedsheets. He immediately apologized for his outburst and blaming it on feeling unwell, but he still told her to come to church because he could take care of Hannah. After Samantha left, Curtis changed the sheets and washed away the evidence. Curtis then took Hannah to the library and distracted her with a children's book while he looked up information about mental illness. On the way home, they stopped at a grocery store to buy a lot of canned goods. This causes them to be late for lunch with Hannah's family, who judge him for missing church. In the afternoon, Curtis began cleaning out the storm shelter and stocking up on all the canned goods he brought in case of emergency. Then he was there reading books from the library. Sometime later, Curtis finally went to the doctor and explained that he had been having trouble sleeping for 4 days. At first, the doctor thought it wasn't serious, so Curtis also told him about his nightmares, admitting that he wetted the bed and continued to feel pain from the dog bite. The doctor agreed to give him medication for a few days and advised him to see a psychiatrist in Columbus. Meanwhile, Samantha went to the insurance agency to ask about Hannah's hearing restoration. Fortunately, her request was approved and all expenses would be covered because Curtis had. The job offers a very good salary. At the same time, Curtis went to the pharmacy to get medicine and was surprised to learn that he didn't have to pay much thanks to insurance. That evening, the family gets together for a nice dinner to celebrate the good news, but Curtis doesn't tell them about his medication. Getting ready for bed, Samantha started planning a vacation since they wouldn't have to worry about money anymore. Curtis secretly took pills. In the bathroom, the next morning, Curtis woke up well-rested and Samantha noticed that he looked healthier too. However, at work, Curtis was still discussing with Duarte about the appropriate amount of food for a shelter. Suddenly, he began to hear thunder in the still clear sky. He asked Duarte, and he didn't hear anything, so Curtis panicked and ran to the trash can to throw it up. Struggling with a panic attack, Curtis left work and began having trouble breathing while driving. So he stopped the car briefly and regained control. When he finally calmed down, he noticed a place that sold containers and took one to expand his shelter. A while later, he visited his mother, who was behaving awkwardly because she was heavily medicated. It turns out she was paranoid schizophrenic at the same age as Curtis is today. He feared the same thing might happen to her and tried to ask some questions, but she didn't remember much about those stressful years. Later, Curtis called his uncle, doctor, to explain that he could not drive in any way in Columbus to find a psychiatrist, so he asked for an alternative. That night, he calculated how much it would cost to convert the shelter into a full bunker. The next morning, he went to the bank to borrow money to repair the house without telling his wife or heeding the agent's warnings. Later, at work, Curtis asked Duarte for help because he wanted to collect materials from work to build his bunker. It was against the rules, but Duarte agreed to help him. A worried Duarte also asked him if he was okay, and Curtis assured him that he was fine. After work, Curtis went to see a local consultant and abandoned any theories based on the research he had done. The woman explained that she was just a counselor, so she couldn't diagnose him or prescribe anything, but they could talk so she could guide him through the crisis. Panicked, he started talking about his mother, who had left the family, and his father had to support him and his brother. She was later found eating trash from the trash can, and they had to take her to the state hospital. He also started talking about his dreams. In the evening, the family went to another school meeting. On the way home, Curtis stopped the car because he saw tons of lightning in the sky. However, his family was still sleeping and none of the drivers responded, making him even more worried about his mental health. On Saturday, while Samantha and Hannah were at the fair, Curtis and Duarte began work on the shelter. When Samantha arrives and sees everything, she panics and an argument occurs. Samantha gets even angrier when she hears about Curtis' loan and screams for an explanation for all the strange decisions he's made lately, like locking Red up. However, Curtis said there was nothing to explain and left the room to see Hannah while Samantha was collapsing. That night, Curtis took more medicine than necessary. In the middle of the night, Samantha woke up and saw Curtis having a seizure and bleeding next to her. She immediately called an ambulance, ignoring Curtis when he said it wasn't necessary. A while later, after the paramedics left, Curtis finally told Samantha everything. He swears that he sees a counselor regularly because he doesn't want to leave his family like his mother did. The next day, Curtis and Samantha take Hannah to the hospital for a checkup, and she is scheduled to have surgery in 6 weeks. At work, Curtis went to his boss and asked him to remove Duarte from his team because he did not want to give orders to his best friend. Jim thought it was strange but agreed before pointing out that Curtis missed a lot at work. Curtis explains that it was because Hannah went to see a doctor, but Jim gave him a warning. After work, Curtis went to a store to buy a gas mask, which turned out to be very expensive. Meanwhile, Duart's wife tells Samantha about the rumors behind Curtis' behavior, but Samantha gets defensive and swears that they are doing it. Sometime later, Curtis was working at the shelter when he was visited by his brother Kyle, who had heard about his strange behavior from Samantha. Kyle is worried about Curtis' health, but Curtis keeps saying he's fine and tells Kyle to visit their mother. It's clear that the brothers have a very difficult relationship. Before Kyle leaves, Curtis remembers that he is looking for a dog and asks him to take Red. On a stormy afternoon, Curtis walked into the kitchen and saw Samantha soaking wet from the rain. They looked at each other for a moment before she considered reaching for a knife. But that's another dream. At breakfast, Curtis cannot escape this terrifying nightmare feeling, and when Samantha tries to touch his hand, he pushes her away. Just then, they notice Jim waiting outside. Curtis rushes to see him and hears terrible news. Jim discovered the equipment Curtis borrowed illegally, so he fired him for just 2 more health insurance. Duart also received 2 weeks of unpaid administrative leave for his support. When Curtis broke the news to Samantha, she slapped him before rushing out of the room with Hannah. Later, Curtis goes to see his counselor and finds out that the woman has transferred schools and has a new boyfriend. The guy wants him to start over, but Curtis can't stand seeing his mother and not making progress, so he leaves without saying a word. He returns to the shelter and continues working there. Meanwhile, Samantha continues to repair clothes for her neighbors to earn more money, but it's still not enough, and she has to take the rest of her savings from their vacation box. In the evening, Samantha talks to Curtis, who explains that her shaking was due to a dream and holds her hand to prove that he's working on it. Samantha announces that they're canceling the beach trip and will use her last check to cover 2 months of bills. She will postpone Hannah's surgery, and they both must focus on finding jobs. Samantha is willing to solve their problems, but she makes the condition that Curtis see a real psychiatrist. She also wants him to come for dinner at school on the weekend to help with his quarantine situation. On the evening of the event, Curtis was confronted by Duart, who blamed him for his suspension. Curtis tries to ask him to talk later, privately, but Duart continues to complain that Curtis interrupts him when they are supposed to be friends. Duart pushed and even hit Curtis, who pushed him away. Finally breaking, Curtis screamed and threw a table to the ground. He announces that a devastating storm is approaching and no one is ready to face it. Then he had an accident and Samantha took the opportunity to take him home. Sometime later, Curtis saw Hannah in the middle of the street and ran to find her. Just then, a flock of birds appeared in the sky and flew in strange shapes before moving towards Curtis. He protected Hannah while the birds flew past them, then they did another strange pattern before starting to fall to their deaths. Terrified, he ran into the house when the sirens began to sound. At that moment, he woke up and discovered the mermaid was performing in real life. It was raining heavily, so Curtis led his family and fled to a shelter. After locking the door, Curtis asked them to wear oxygen masks as a precaution. Then they fell asleep and waited for the storm to pass. A few hours later, Curtis woke up and checked the door, but he can still feel the storm outside, and I went back to sleep. In the morning, Samantha woke him up by asking him to open the door because the storm had passed. Curtis disagreed and said he could still hear it. He even made Samantha touch the door so she could smell it. However, Samantha didn't hear or feel anything. Panicked, Curtis backed away and refused to open the door, giving the key to his wife. Samantha refuses to accept because doing it for her would only delay the matter and Curtis must face his fears. Wanting to do good for his family, Curtis gathered his strength and finally opened the door to find a beautiful sunny day. The neighbors are doing a good job and are picking up trash left behind by the storm. Sometime later, Samantha finally took Curtis to a psychiatrist. The doctor immediately agreed to give Curtis more medication and decided that he needed to leave the shelter. He told the family to take a few days off to rest and prepare because Curtis would need to be taken to a specialist facility until he recovered. This means he won't see his family for a while. The next day, the whole family is at the beach. Curtis and Hannah were making a sandcastle, when suddenly Hannah gestured the word storm to the ocean. Samantha goes outside and discovers that it is raining oil. Just then, the family sees a huge dark storm approaching in the distance, and Curtis turns to Samantha, who nods at him to confirm that she can see it too. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel.